Mrs. Kenkel went to Kansas University to college and graduated from there and is a very proud Jayhawks supporter. We have our little differences because I'm an Iowa State supporter, but that's okay. They have
So is my husband.
They have a much better basketball team than we do this year, so we'll just let it be. But anyway, and she's been very active in the community for a long time on lots of different things. So here's your camera down by your hand right there. Okay, are you ready? Okay, first question.
Okay, so this year's theme is conflict and compromise. So, how do you see the protest against the Vietnam War as a conflict?
It was a conflict because not everybody agreed with our stance in the war. There were some that were adamantly opposed to the war and to American involvement in the war, and there were other people that believed that our presence in Vietnam was very necessary in keeping communism away from Southeast Asia and hopefully away from America.
Okay. Do you want to read the next question?
Sure. All right. Just the cameraman.
Were there ever compromises with the protesters?
Were there ever compromises with the protesters?
Like the protesters made a compromise with the government for the war.
Or maybe their opinions.
Other way around.
Yeah.
Compromises by the protesters. Well, the fact that we have freedom of speech and the protesters have the right to peacefully assemble and peacefully demonstrate against the war. I would guess the compromise would be with the community and with the university, wherever the protesters chose to march or demonstrate, as long as no laws were being broken. The compromise was you have the right to voice your opinion, as long as nobody is hurt, as long as you don't keep people from going into, say, the student union and getting something to drink and being able to go in and out, as long as you're not hurting the businesses. I think that was the compromise.
Okay.
Did you ever protest? When people would protest, did it ever get super out of hand to where houses would be burned down?
Actually, yes. My freshman year, this would be spring of 1970, the protests, there were, from what I read in the Lawrence newspaper, people from outside of Lawrence came into Lawrence to highlight their disagreement with America being in the war. And there were shots that were fired, and I believe somebody was wounded. I don't know if somebody was killed. I'd have to go back and check on that. You could probably pull that up, 1970 Lawrence, Kansas newspaper. But the National Guard was called in. Our student union was burned down. People heroically went into the student union, grabbed pictures, artifacts that would have been lost forever had people not gone in and pulled them out.
Well, I just have a side, sort of question here. We are actually doing that protest in our play, and I get to play you. And it's like I'm being you writing a letter to your father.
Okay.
So, did anyone ever give that protest a name? Or was it just the protest of at Lloyd?
At Lawrence.
Yeah.
I don't know that protest was ever given a name. And in fact, when you're talking about the burning of the student union, I think that I don't think that was an organized march and the Union burned as a result of an organized march. That was mayhem by
A few
a
students.
few students or non-students. I mean, I think what they were trying to do, in my opinion, was to draw attention to the fact that it wasn't only on the East Coast or the West Coast that students were protesting the war. It could happen in the middle of the country in rural America. You know, Kansas was perceived as a very peaceful rural area where things like that didn't happen. So the Union burned. I watched it from the 10th floor of my dorm. It was kind of a scary time because all of a sudden you had gunshots that were being, all of a sudden there was gunfire. National Guard came in. As a freshman student, of course, you're not as frightened, I don't remember ever thinking, oh my goodness, if I walk to classes, am I afraid for my life? That never came across my mind. But we did meet in the football stadium, and we were given the option to vote on whether we should continue with classes and take our finals like we always would, and then go home, or whether we wanted to freeze our grades and go home so that no student lives were in jeopardy. And, again, as a dumb freshman, oh, let's freeze my grades and then I don't have to study anymore and go to any more classes, and I'm doing pretty good right up to this point. And, I don't think that I felt the seriousness of it like, say, you would if you were a parent of a child that was at the university.
Do you know of other universities in the Midwest that had similar protests? They had at KU. Was that ever publicized? Or?
I think across the nation, Iowa State had protests. Ohio. I mean, I think it was across the United States, because the people that were being most directly affected by the Vietnam War were the kids my age. They were the ones that were there. They were given a draft number, and if their draft number was low enough, they had no choice. They had to report. They had to be in the military, quick training, and sent to Southeast Asia to fight a war that they may or may not have understood. They may or may not have been yes, this is a noble cause, and it's different than my father's interpretation when World War II happened, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Boy, you couldn't get to a place fast enough to sign up because you're defending your country. When World War II in Europe was happening, and from my point of view as a Jewish person, Jews were being rounded up, taken away from their homes and businesses, and murdered and treated horribly. So there was a cause. I don't know in the Vietnam War if there was a clear, like, why are we there? And why are we losing our children, our brothers and sisters? We didn't really understand, or I believe the protesters didn't really understand why we were there, why we were fighting, and as we saw on television and the reports of this many people died today, this many people died this week, this many people, why? There were the people that were protesting felt down to their toenails, I don't get why we're there. I don't get why there's this loss of life. So I believe that it affected everybody all over the United States.
What do you think the direct impact of the protesting was on political officials? From your vantage point, was there any?
I think initially, before it became so kind of networked nationally, I think the politicians looked at the people in my age bracket as, yeah, they don't, what do they know? They've got too much time on their hands. Um, thinking about our discussions at the dinner table with my dad, who was a World War II veteran, he was a firm believer that, as his president was telling him, if we did not go in and defend the South Vietnamese and allow them to be a free country, the communists were going to take over South Vietnam and then other countries in Southeast Asia and then right on to the United States. And they called that the domino theory, the domino effect.
We have that, don't we?
Where you set up the dominoes and you go ping and they do. That was my dad's belief. And my dad's belief was, I served my country proudly, and there were many around me that sacrificed their lives. Your generation owes our country the same respect, and you need to go fight. What we find out now, years later, is the exaggeration of how successful, and I say that like this, that the government officials wanted us to believe things were in Vietnam, but that wasn't true. And I think the people my age who were going to be the ones to have to go to Vietnam and fight this war that many of us didn't understand what we were fighting for, and many came back in body bags. We weren't going to sit down and take that. We were not, and I think at first the politicians thought, this young generation, they're so lazy, they don't want to go fight. You know, what's the matter with them? But as the groundswell became bigger and bigger and bigger, the politicians, I believe, were forced to take us seriously, and by us I mean the generation.
Do you think Beyond Vietnam's speech had an impact and helped the movement?
I would love to think so. Maybe a smidgen, but I think the African American struggle in and of itself was so difficult that while some politicians may have, yes, that was brave and what great words, behind closed doors, the African Americans were having a terrible time getting footing, being believed, getting the rights and the respect that was due to them. So I would have to say my personal belief was our country had such a strong undercurrent of
Civil distrust.
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What do you think Senator Kerry's impact was when he came back and testified? And he made, we were there doing all these bad things. What impact would his testimony have had?
More, but I think what the people my age were searching for was somebody to believe. Who do you believe? Who do you believe? And I think coming from if you have experienced firsthand what the fighting was like in Southeast Asia, you have much more credibility, I think, than somebody that has never been in the military, has never, I think street cred. I think he had street cred. And I think that's for some who were kind of, I don't know who to believe. And it was that mishmash during that time in the 1960s, 1970s. Who do you believe? I mean, I think we held our presidents on a pedestal, that if the president says it's this and this and this, that's what it is. And, you know, again, if you'll read what has been uncovered, you know, I'd say in the last 5 years, that we were given a bill of goods to.
I think we were hoodwinked into believing this, and it was really not what they were telling us. If you were looking at this theme, what would be the important parts that you would want to bring out in a play? You know, what do you think would be some crucial points that, because it's conflict and compromise, and
Yes.
their premises, there was no, the protesters didn't compromise their beliefs. That's their take on the compromise. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. So how would you handle the conflict part? What would you think would be important points that would go with that? Because it's not taking a stand. That's a different topic, even though it kind of goes together.
Well, I think for me it came down to the conflict was, who do you believe? What do you believe? I mean, you know, in my family, my parents were the rocks. They were the, you know, well, Dad says and Dad knows, and my dad and I disagreed on this. You know, he thought the protesters were, you know, a bunch of whiners that, you know, what do they
What
know?
did he think when you did it?
I don't believe I shared that with him. I believe that I just did what I was doing, and he didn't ask either. I mean, he, you know, I was there to get an education, and, you know, I knew that his stance about the protesters were they didn't know what they were talking about, that they didn't have all the facts, and that we have to, if our government says you go and you serve, by God, that's what you do.
Did you ever witness, or like, what did you think about the protests where people would make fun of the military people who had just come back from Vietnam?
Or did you see any of them?
Yes, I did, and there was, I mean, gosh, it was everywhere. You know, talking to the military members that served, they would get rid of their military uniforms before they boarded a plane because they were given, you know, people said terrible things to them, and they were spit upon, and they, you know.
Well, Mick Gutta from Trainer State Bank, he talks about coming through the either LA or San Francisco, I think it's probably LA airport, coming back, and he was spit at because he had his military uniform on.
It was not something that you didn't proudly come back. There wasn't a parade in your honor, no matter how valiant your service was. The things that the military members saw that they never talked about, post-traumatic stress, they kept inside horrible things that they saw, that they did. I remember on campus especially, the military was not revered and respected. And, you know, thinking back on it, you know, those poor kids, yes, some of them enlisted because they thought, I might as well enlist and have a choice of which branch of the service I want to go into than be drafted and be told you're going to go here. So many of them felt helpless, like they had no choice. And then they come back and they have to make sense of what they've seen and what they've done. They have to try to cobble together, you know, do I go to school and get training to become something? And many of them would never say that they served in Vietnam, that they served in the military, because of the negativity with people their age if they found out that they were in the military.
My grandpa wears his hat every day because he fought in Vietnam, so he would just put on his hat when he got up and he would just wear it every day.
And some
everywhere.
people, Corwin, are very, very proud of their service and have every right to be proud
Absolutely.
of their service. But for some, it was,
Embarrassing?
no, I don't want to say embarrassing. It was a very dark time. And they witnessed things and saw things that nobody should ever see. And so they kind of walled it off, and it's there, but they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to go back and revisit it, because it was such a dark experience for them. You know, I think back to a gentleman many years ago at the Jewish Community Center. His name is Sam Freed. And I had students interview him for a National History Day project. And he said he didn't know how much he would be able to tell us. There were a couple of other Holocaust survivors there. And the kids were very respectful. And when we were done, he said, you know, this is the first time I've really ever talked about that experience more than one or two sentences. And one of the kids said, and why is that? Because you told us so many things. He said, because it's something I just always wanted to forget. I just didn't want to ever think about that really bad time again. So I think it's the same thing. It was just so awful that if they could just put it in a box and put the lid on, I don't ever have to go back there. So to me, that's why. And however, for your grandpa, it's like, yeah, I served. And that's a wonderful thing. I'm glad that he does that. How old was your brother when all of this drafting was going on?
He's 2 years younger than me.
So he'd been 17?
Yes, 16, 17. He had kind of a middle of the road draft number. So he got to go to college, and then the war ended before he was, you know, would have been possibly drafted. But I think that was another, you know, part of the conflict was, you know, how do you feel about your siblings going through basic training in a big fat hurry and then shipped off to a country far, far different from what you have been accustomed to, and you're put in situations where there's a lot of discomfort, you know, both physically and mentally. So, you know, the protesters had a big stake in it, in that it was their families and friends that were affected by this.
And you do also have to remember that there were people who got low draft numbers but had money in their back pockets and
Could get out of
going. And so if you were a young man who was darker in color, that didn't have wealthy resources, you didn't have a choice. You went. And I'm not saying that they were all Black Americans or Hispanic Americans, but color was a definite issue at that time, because your parents probably didn't have the money to buy you out. And I don't know what buying out means, but they didn't have the money to put it behind, so you didn't have to go.
Or connections with people in politics that could defer your service. That could say, you know what, we'll set this aside and.
So, those are things that are part of the conflict too. Who went? For a lot of people, it was the people that couldn't afford to get a deferment.
Mm-hmm.
It was the people that couldn't afford to do this, and that was a huge part of the conflict too. And that's sort of where Dr. King's speech came in, as he said, "Why are we sending all of our kids to fight in a war that we don't believe in?" I mean, we go back to the civil rights and the disparity and those things. Okay.
I was told that some people that got drafted and they didn't have the money, they went up to Canada.
Yes, there were those
Yes.
that chose to do that.
Yes, and there were conscientious objectors that could, they wouldn't serve because of their religious beliefs. But again, they were ostracized by, again, my parents' generation who, well, I didn't exactly want to go over to, Japan or Europe or, fight in World War II, but that's sometimes what you have to do, and they saw them as cowards.
And Anubi is doing a project on conscientious objectors, so it's been really interesting to understand that particular story. But you're right, people did go to Canada, and I'm sure there's still people in Canada that haven't come back because they just felt so much that the war was such a wrong thing, and they were not going to put themselves in a position of fighting for something that they couldn't believe, so they just left.
Or any war.
Yeah.
Or any war.
There's been people that have done that all along. Okay, what else would you like to ask this lovely
Mom, we
lady?
had some.
Did your mom agree with your dad about that that people should go to and fight in the war, or was she?
I think she was of that generation that believed that if you are called to serve, you go and you don't question. Our generation was asking the questions. Why? When so many are dying each week, and they're sent to these jungle, this country far away, and they come back permanently injured or killed or psychologically damaged. We're the ones questioning because it affects us. My parents, my mom would agree with my dad that, we and there were huge sacrifices made by families during World War II.
And you have to know her mom. She was a very confident, outspoken lady. So it wasn't she was just agreeing with her dad.
No.
If she would have disagreed, she'd have let you know. She was not of that age group that I'll just do whatever my husband says.
Did you ever get out with some people and actually go and protest it?
I marched on Jayhawk Boulevard, not sure how strong my convictions were at the time that I did it. It was kind of I'll go do this and see what this is all about. But yes, and there were, you could see protests in a lot of different places, in Lawrence. There were students that were very proactive. They had very organized groups, and they had organized, we're going to go here, we're going to march there. Similarly, you're seeing from the shootings that we had recently, the same kind of thing with students organizing, we're going to go to our state capitol and talk about gun laws and things that we can do so that nobody else has to go through what we went through last week. So it's, you've got a center core of true believers that are very passionate about the fact that they didn't believe we should be in the war, and they would organize, and then they would network with other groups, and all of this without social media, without cell phones, without...
Because one of the reasons that, or I think one of the reasons that people are making these connections is because of that platform.
Yes, very, very much so.
Yeah,
And
for
what
us.
we had was, the national news was in my living room every night. You know, we always have the news on, and we watched the national news, and they had a big segment of it where they showed actual fighting in Vietnam, and then they had the body count, how many were killed, how many were injured, and you could see those statistics every single day. And then they would summarize for the week. And then we had newspapers, our local newspapers, that you could read articles about it, although I would venture to guess that more kids my age were more visual media.
Because it was the first time that you saw as real time as it could get what the war was about. And in World War II, there weren't any TVs.
No.
So you went to the local movie theater to watch a movie on the weekend, and they did a newsreel, and they would talk about the war. But it was a very glorified picture of the war. They sold war bonds through those kinds of things. So you didn't have that immediacy of knowing what was going on. You had the radio, and you might have listened to that, but you didn't have that immediacy. And that wasn't even there in the Korean War because we didn't have that technology. But come to the Vietnam War, we had technology. And so that, I think, is one of the real reasons that people were able to grasp what was happening much more quickly and much more arduously to protest, because they were watching it and you saw it every day.
Do you think that the Vietnam War would have ended out differently, like less protesters, if there wouldn't have been like TV news about it every single day? Like they didn't broadcast it so much?
Do you think it would have been a different kind of protest? Is that what
Yeah.
you're saying?
Yeah.
Like maybe less protesters, and the protesters didn't actually, they were more like with World War II, where they're like, let's just follow our president, because they don't know.
No, I think the protests would have been as hardy. I think it would have grabbed as many, again, because of the fact that it was affecting our age group. And I think there were so many more students that were in college in the 60s and 70s than the 40s and 50s. So you have a broader base, you have more kids, and again, I think it was the fact that it was from our communities, from our high schools. We could put names with faces. Oh yeah, I know this person that died in Vietnam. Oh, so-and-so's funeral is going to be, you know, we have that personal effect.
I had a missing in action bracelet that I wore from 1969 until I got married. I took it off the day I got married. I'd never taken it off, and that soldier never came home. And it was a metal bracelet, and it had his name and the date that he went missing.
I had the same. I had a sorority sister's brother-in-law that was missing in action, and he was never found.
I'm pretty sure I read about that. She passed them out among the college campus. That might have been something else. But I heard that someone's brother-in-law had gone missing in action, and she was trying to like raise awareness, and she passed
could
out
be.
his.
Yeah,
That could
lots of families. This friend of mine that was in my sorority, you know, would give them out, and you would wear them, and it would be a way to not forget, to raise awareness. Oh, what is that bracelet you're wearing? Oh, this is so and so. He was a fighter pilot. He's missing in action. He hasn't been found yet.
So those were other ways that people protested. You know, that was my way to protest. I mean, my dad served during the Korean War, but he got a draft notice, and the guy at the post office in Tennessee said, you have 24 hours, buddy. Either you enlist or I deliver the draft notice. And there were 3 of them that had gone off to college, and they all 3 went and enlisted in the Air Force because they did not want to go into the Army, because they knew the Army meant they were going to Korea. And my dad was a supply chain person on stateside, which ultimately became his career. And he ended up being the head comptroller for all the bases, but the postmaster said, you got 24 hours to make a decision. I'm going to hold those draft notices for 24 hours.
Wow.
And he shouldn't have done it because that was illegal, but he gave him a chance to go enlist in the Korean War. And my dad goes, I don't want to go to Korea. He'd just been to college for a semester. So he served, but he made a choice as to where he was going to go serve. Okay, what else would you like to ask Mrs. Kenkel?
When you were talking about that you did protest, what made you want to protest?
I think just to feel what it was like, just to have that experience, to, you know, it's one thing to be a spectator, it's one thing to be a participant. I think I just wanted to know what that was like.
That's kind of
Was
funny
there-
because
Was there any like things in the protests that you participated in that surprised you, that it like you didn't think the protest would be like?
No, it was very predictable,
Okay.
very predictable. You know, we were chanting, you know, there were the little protest ditties.
Heck no, we won't go.
Yes.
oh yeah.
I told them they couldn't use the other word. It was heck no, we won't go. Okay, what else should we ask Mrs. Kenkel?
What was the mood on the campus when the protest was going on?
Well, when they weren't going on,
Like,
was there like
when
a
they were.
negative mood?
Like a vibe. Like what kind of vibe was going on? I don't know. I tried to find a word.
That's a new term of 2017.
I don't know. I tried to find.
What was the
something.
mood on the campus when the protests weren't happening?
Just a normal college?
Just regular, you know, we were a campus of 25,000 kids. So, you know, we were all concerned about going to class, reading, you know, keeping up, making our grades, normal, you know, socializing with other, you know, there was that mishmash of our lives that certainly kept us busy. I mean, it's not like I don't have anything else to do, so I think I'll focus on protesting or the war.
That just became an additional piece.
Yes, it was, yeah, I mean, we all had, I think, minimum 14 hours of classes that were very rigorous and very different than what I had ever experienced in high school. So I was scrambling to keep up with my studies and make sure that I had, you know, good enough grades that I could continue.
Okay, what else? Is that it?
That's all we
Is
had.
that our list?
Just for play purpose, did you wear glasses?
I am not gonna wear contacts, so.
Like what type of glasses?
I get what
if
you
you
mean.
did. Yeah.
Back then, did you?
Yeah.
Gosh, did I
Jasmine's
wear
purple.
glasses back then?
You guys are gonna buy me a new pair of glasses?
Who said I was gonna buy you a new pair of glasses?
Who
I'm
said
not
they were
gonna
be
do that.
all the way full new glasses.
Yeah.
They're expensive
So
if they're
I
used
wear
too.
glasses. I mean, I don't.
Not wearing
Okay,
contacts.
then you're good. You're good. It'll be
Okay.
fine.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Good luck with your play.
Thank you.
Um,